Welcome to the Tower of Bible podcast, brought to you by Bible and Archaeology. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Cargill, and I'm here with the Jordans, Dr. Jordan Smith and Jordan Jones, and we are honored to have with us our guest today, who, if you are in the realm of archaeology, you've probably heard of her before, Dr. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott at William Jessup University, but recently got a new gig at Baylor University. So Dr. Shafer-Elliott, welcome and congratulations on the new gig.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you.
And I know because when I brought him here to the University of Iowa, you know one of our hosts here quite well.
I do.
So, for good or evil.
Yeah, for better or for worse. So why don't we have Joe? It's just going to be confusing having Jordan and Jordan. I mean, it's great, you know, if you're in Israel, there's a nice river, but let's have Jones talk about you a little bit more and maybe ask the first couple of questions.
That sounds great.
Yes, Cynthia, thank you for coming today. I'm very happy to get the chance to speak with you. I just wanted to start by asking, your specialty is in the household, in archaeology and food and biblical studies, but for a lot of people, that's new territory as they're engaging with things. And so just set up for us, what sparked your interests to get into what is for a lot of people a more niche area of study?
Yeah, wow. I haven't been asked that question in a long time about how you got into this type of thing. Well, I've always loved biblical studies, but in particular, the daily life of ancient Israel as seen in the Hebrew Bible, but also as seen through material culture and archaeology, and how that conversation can be done using those two fields. And so when I was working on my master's, I was really inspired by a lot of feminist scholarship and looking at women in ancient Israel, and especially in the Iron Age. And I wanted to do more of that for my PhD, but I also didn't want to do strictly a gender topic because I knew that I was thinking ahead as far as getting a job. And I thought, okay, I need to do something that's a little bit broader. But something that could include gender. And I remember just sitting at my kitchen table and I thought, I was reading some sort of passage because I was writing a proposal for my PhD application. And I thought, I just read something about food. And I thought, I wonder if anybody's done a lot of work on this. And after some more research, I saw that, well, within Hebrew Bible studies, most of the work on food has been interested in the kashrut, the dietary laws, the sacrificial system. And then within archaeology, any kind of food studies were really limited to elite feasting. And I thought, those are all great, but I'm really interested in the daily life. And so I decided to work on that. And at the same time, there were some other who are now colleagues and friends who were starting work on their PhDs in food-related topics. And we all kind of found each other through Nathan MacDonald, if you are familiar with him and his work. He was just working on the manuscripts of his 2 food books. And he was really the only one who had recently done something food-related that wasn't related to the food prohibitions or the sacrificial system. And so for me, it was just a keen interest in how did your average ancient Israelite live? And what did their houses look like? What did they do all day? How did they cook their food? And it just kind of snowballed from there.
So it had nothing to do with going over to Israel and tasting the cuisine and saying, well, I got to learn more about this, right?
That would be a better answer. That would be a much more interesting story. I do love Israeli food, so that would be a better story, but it just kind of happened.
Well, with that in mind, can you explain a little bit of the setup with the new publication, the T&T Clark Handbook of Food and the Hebrew Bible and Ancient Israel, working on that with Carol Myers and Yanling Fu, of this kind of more comprehensive approach to studying food and explain for the audience kind of what that is and what the impetus was of leading up. You were mentioning there's not a lot that's been said about a lot of these areas. And so how you and your colleagues decided to go about putting this forward and what you're really hoping that the audience and future students or just the public can get out of this book.
Yeah. Well, those of us that had started working on dissertations related to food, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we were kind of all brought together by Nathan McDonald. And then we got together at SBL and we started 2 sessions, one at ASOR and one at SBL, and 2 food related sessions. And so people who were just starting to work on food and food related topics, we started coming together at those conferences. And then Dominic Massos at TNT Clark Bloomsbury approached us. I think this was around 2015. And I was the co-chair for the food session at SBL. And both, of course, Jan Ling Fu and Carol Myers have been, part of the founding members of both those sessions. And they approached us about doing a volume like the one we just published, because they had just done one for the New Testament and they wanted a companion volume. And they knew that we were really the only people doing food related topics. And so we were able to talk Carol Myers to coming on board. She's just super busy and very prolific, but Carol was gracious enough to lend us her expertise and her time. And it took longer than we anticipated to do because, of course, COVID. And then when you're trying to edit a volume it's like herding cats, if you have a bunch of contributors. And so things took a while, but we're really pleased with it. We have multiple chapters on just about every aspect related to food that we could think of. And I'm sure we left out some topics, and maybe absentmindedly or what have you. But we kind of saw this book as an introduction or the first place that people could go to who are doing any kind of food related, whether it's the sole topic of their research or whether it's just a secondary part of their research that they just need to have, some sort of citation on it. And it's kind of your one-stop shop for all things food related to the Hebrew Bible and ancient Israel. And we're really proud of it.
It really addresses what is seemingly a gaping hole in what has been published and what has been compiled of, if you're looking for things, if you can find the niche article or publication, you might be well set. But as a student, I'm very happy that you all were able to do this and wrestle those cats together, because I think it is something that for students like myself going forward is going to be an excellent resource, especially showing in areas that may not have been addressed now, where can this be developed in the future and where can this go? Because there's so much to be said still.
Oh, sure. I completely agree. And that was one reason why we wanted to make sure each chapter had a few suggested readings, annotated bibliography on some suggested readings, and that these are people who are working in these areas and they know these topics really, really well. And so as far as, and of course, again, what you said is completely true as far as seeing that there's further avenues for research that could still be going on. I mean, it's by no means the end of the conversation. It's really just the beginning.
Kind of following along with that, I actually have a student I've been working with. She's writing an honors thesis, and I wish that I had noticed this or been able to talk to you before, because she's been interested in the idea of vegetarianism within the narratives. And we got to Daniel chapter 1, and I was just talking with her, and I'm used to, kind of like you were saying, doing the whole kosher laws, and then she started pointing out to me that that's about nuts, and they're different. There are different types of foods that are there, and I found that fascinating. And I'm glad that we have that opportunity, or that I know now that there's this resource. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I hope it will be happy and helpful to all sorts of people.
I of course, appreciate all the work you do with public scholarship. Of course, you're not only a researcher and an excellent teacher in the classroom, but you do a lot of work and take the time to actually reach out to the public as well, like doing podcasts and doing lectures for the public as well. As you know, I think that's an important part of scholarship. I think it's an often neglected part of scholarship. I wish more scholars took the time to speak directly to the public. And so I want to, as we jump back and forth in between your personal research and public scholarship, speak to why it's important to do public scholarship. Why do you think it's, I mean, of course it's important to teach students, and of course it's important to do, original research, to do, to go on archaeological excavations, to do original research. But why is it important also to do responsible public scholarship directly to the public?
That's such a good question. And I do think public scholarship is really important. And I agree. I think I would love it to see more scholars doing that. I think the thing that comes to mind regularly for me is I often hear scholars from a variety of settings, almost kind of, I don't want to say being insulting, but they talk in such a way about people who aren't in the academy and kind of joking around maybe, or maybe they're being serious about how they seem a little annoyed, if I could put it that way, a little annoyed when people don't know something that they take for granted as common knowledge. And I understand that feeling. I'm not being judgmental at all, but it just got me thinking about how we are getting mad at people for not knowing what they don't know.
Right. Well, or that things that we took 15 years to learn, right? That we had the privilege, let's just be honest, of
it is a privilege.
And the money to spend on an education that took us quite a while to learn. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think if we really want people to understand not only our own research, but to be more aware of a bigger conversation that's out there, that things are not as black and white as the Learning Channel makes it seem, or the Discovery Channel or the History Channel, but that if we, as the people who are doing this kind of work, can be involved and make sure that people know that the conversation is that there is still a conversation, first of all, going on. There's always conversations. Scholars can never agree on anything, but that the conversation is still going, and it's much more complex than that the media typically portrays it to be. And I think if we took some time, I go to seniors groups, I go to schools, I like doing the podcasts and, stuff for different organizations. And I think it's all really important because people are eager to learn. I really think they are. And they want to learn from the people who are doing it. And I think for the most part, people are open if you approach it in such a way that's not combative, that's respectful and gracious. I think that's really important because, nobody likes to be embarrassed or put down. And I think if you're trying to, be helpful, if you're trying to pass on what you've learned, then the way we go about it is important.
I think that's a key a role. In one of my past jobs doing public scholarship, let's say, I always took that seriously, that you don't want to be condescending.
Right.
The people that are engaging you are usually very well learned. They have an enthusiastic knowledge of the subject. They often know quite a bit. They're oftentimes paying money to come and learn, or they're taking the time to come to Bible and Archaeology website, and they have an interest in this stuff. You don't want to condescend. You do want to be entertaining, but you want to be credible. And so you don't want to do this just to take advantage of them. You don't want to do this to just make money, just to sell tickets, just to get your name in the paper. You want to have something to give them. You don't just want to rehash the same thing you did last year and the thing before and the thing before just to raise money for your foundation. You want to do something new, something that contributes something. You want to have a genuine conversation with them. You want to have an actual relationship with them. And I think that's how you build an audience. If you have a genuine relationship with them as students, lifelong learners, they don't have to be in your classroom.
Right.
But if you treat them with respect and you treat them as people who maybe didn't go to grad school, but they're coming to you and they say, hey, we're interested in learning this material and we want to do this.
Right.
Right. I think that makes our jobs as educators easier when you are talking directly to the public, because they aren't misinformed. They actually know better, right? They know things, and they can learn that not everything, as you mentioned, in life is certain. That ambiguity and uncertainty is a good thing. That scholars disagree with one another. And you can learn that there might be 2 or 3 good solutions to the archaeological evidence, and there might be 10 or 12 really bad interpretations. But you know, it's not about knowing the truth. It's knowing there are 2 or 3 good explanations, and then there are a bunch of bad explanations.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Another thing that I always remember is that I try to keep in mind is that we're all interpreters, and I can learn something from them too, and their perspective and point of view. So I appreciate when I do these things and hearing from them when they have questions and they have insights that I have not thought of, and I think that's really important to come to these things and not just thinking, oh, I have all the answers, or I have the degrees or the experience or the books or whatever. But that it is a conversation.
Do you feel, you had mentioned earlier, you're really wanting to get to how they lived, how these people lived, and the practices, the elements, the items that were a part of their lives. And in this question of public scholarship, but also within the academic community, do you find that is taken maybe less seriously out of the gate? Do you find yourself having to defend household archaeology or the study of food, or do you feel that people are immediately receptive and connect with this idea because food is such a thing that we all connect with? It is an intimate object that we all have relationships with. Or does that create a barrier where people go, well, I feel like I understand this, so what do you have to say to me about this?
That's a great question, Jordan. I'm very proud of that question.
It's like he had really good teachers.
I was trained very well.
I can be so bold. No, I think that's great. And you know what, to be honest, and I'm thinking about this really just for the first time, I've never had any kind of experience where somebody didn't take hearing about households and food and women and daily life seriously. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think people are fascinated with daily life. I mean, yes, they like hearing about the sensational, artifacts that are, found.
The monumental.
Monumental, right. That's the language we use, the monumental stuff versus the mundane, everyday stuff. And I think people are fascinated by both, but I've never had any experience where a community or a group I'm talking to or students or they've always been fascinated by it because these are things we have in common with the ancients. We live in houses, we have households, families, we eat. So these are things that we still have in common with them. So I think there is a real interest out there for people who want to learn more about daily life and what was it? What did their houses look like? What did they cook? How did they eat? Is the so-called Bible diet cookbook really a good thing?
Do you have an opinion on that?
Oh, I do. I always have opinions.
Mix a little stone into the grain.
Yeah. Exactly. But I think people are fascinated by this, and I'm very grateful because I'm fascinated by it, and it just makes it so much fun to pass on, something that you're passionate about to people who are genuinely interested.
With that split between typically monumental archaeology, as it's called, and household archaeology, that feels so problematic because it does lead sometimes to the verbiage of, is this a mundane place, or this isn't that big glamorous publication piece? Do you feel like that divide in the way we talk about this is harmful to it, or does it present a new space of household archaeology doesn't have to combat with monumental archaeology in these ways, and it can do its own things? Do you feel like that divide between the realms, so to speak, of monumental and household archaeology is beneficial for it, or does it present some problems that you feel you need to discuss or explain when you speak with other archaeologists or students?
Yeah, I've never personally felt, any kind of divide between the two. I mean, yes, people are naturally interested in the sensational, and I guess it depends first on how you define, monumental and how you define mundane, because mundane doesn't necessarily mean boring, right? It's the daily life as opposed to the monumental or sensational, because the Hebrew Bible, of course, at least from my perspective, maybe I shouldn't say of course, is that, written primarily by elite urban men, and they're not concerned with daily life, so to speak, unless it pertains to the narrative that they're trying to communicate. So we get glimpses of daily life in it, but it's not its purpose. I mean, its purpose is to talk about the people, places, and events of prestige, the battlefields, the temples, the palaces, the kings, the priests, the prophets. We don't get, the homemaker's cookbook for Israelites. We don't get that stuff, but we get a little bit. And then we also have archaeology. And of course, those two things together, plus some other tools in our toolbox, are very helpful. But I think when we're using that language of mundane and monumental, we would just need to, you should always begin with your clarification of terms, how you define things. Because I don't think of mundane, maybe mundane is not the right word, but I wouldn't call it boring. I would just say it's the everyday. It's not the special occasions, it's the everyday.
And speaking about language, I'm probably the one text guy here. I'm more of a philosopher or rhetorician, but that is something that I've been trying to do. I'm finding it's one of the more difficult things to help students understand that the people that are writing this are probably like 1% of the population, and that there's how many people are really going to the temple on a daily basis or a weekly basis. So when you try to, or when you explain to students or talk to students about trying to recover voices, or the idea that we can recover voices maybe outside of those elite male views, do you think that that's something we can do well, or is that a kind of a problematic aspect, trying to recreate through the edits?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we won't take the fact that you're just a text person, and we won't hold that against you.
I did dig one summer in Azaka, so I've spent time in a cistern with Bob for a while.
That'll screw you up. That'll screw you up for a lifetime.
That's why they're letting me in here.
Jordan, I think that's a great question. I think we can do it, and I think we can do it well, but I think we need to use all of our resources to do it. I think, of course, we have the text, and of course, we need to consider, all your basic interpretive questions, who, what, when, where, why, who were they writing it to, what's the motivation for writing, and of course, the dating of these texts when they're actually written and what time they're moment to reflect. Those are always questions, and always keeping them in mind. But I don't think that should stop us from using the text to help answer these types of daily life questions. But I think that's where we use all of the tools in our toolbox, including archaeology and the different types of archaeologies, household archaeology being a primary one, gender archaeology, food study, and then looking into other fields and bringing those types of studies, and like bringing in food studies and bringing in household studies. But then also looking at other ancient Near Eastern texts to see how we can get, a bigger picture of what daily life was like. But then again, they have a lot of the same issue too, of the elites doing most of the writing. Then also you have things like iconography or representational art. We have things like ethnography and ethnoarchaeology, things that can help us have a good illustration of what, modern descendants of these ancient communities, what they're doing and how they're doing things. And are they doing anything similar to how their ancient ancestors used to? So I would say if we're just trying to use one tool, then that could be problematic. But if we could use an arsenal of things, or that would be more helpful, I think.
Could I have you explain, just for the audience, you use some terms like gender archaeology,
Sure.
how we're studying food, the various types of food archaeologists, how those are different, or what makes them particular, and how they reveal different things as this is being done. Because if you go onto a dig site, there's a lot of people doing a lot of activity, and they're not all doing the same things. And then when it comes to something like the publication on the Handbook of Food, all of these people are working in different ways. So could you explain for the audience a little of how someone doing something like gender archaeology is able to bring some sense to that and what gender looks like in the ancient world, as opposed to food, and how they can work together in this study of the household?
Sure. So as far as gender archaeology, is really focusing on the men, women, and children. It's not just a woman thing. It's looking at the lives of men, women, and children, and how they lived their lives, how they interacted. So it's focusing more on the people, I would say, who are doing these activities. And then household archaeology is really looking at the house, the dwelling, the artifacts within the dwelling, and then also the spatial relationship. That's an important key within household archaeology, is because when we excavate and you look at any kind of final publications, you typically see artifacts listed by their locus, their phase that they were found in, and not even really more so that, more of, we found 10 cooking pots. In this stratum, we found 20 storage jar fragments. We found one figurine fragment. So we get kind of a list as opposed to knowing exactly where they were found. So spatial analysis within household archaeology really takes seriously the find spot of these artifacts and where they are in relation to the space, the house, and other artifacts or artifact clusters. So a really easy example of that would be okay, you're in some sort of building. Can we clarify what kind of building you're in? Are you in a house? Are you in a courtyard? Are you in a storage room? A storage building, a palace, whatever. So the type of architecture. And then let's say we determine that we're in a house based on the common layout of a typical Iron Age house that we find in the southern Levant during the Iron Age. But say we're in a middle space, and let's say that there's an oven there, and next to the oven is the remains of a cooking pot. And we've also taken some micro samples, and we found olive pits and carbonized grain, and that we have flint, and we have all these things. And where are they located in the room? Where is that room in the house? And then what's their relationship to each other? So where is the oven in comparison to where the cooking pot was found? Are they near each other? If they are, great. What can we determine about, once we determine the space, can we infer what kind of activities occurred in that space? So if we find an oven and cooking pots and flint and carbonized remains, we can make a pretty good guess that we're in the room of what we might call a kitchen, where food preparation occurs. So that seems like a really simple thing to do, but that's not typically how we've done field archaeology. I mean, typically we say, okay, we have this list, as opposed to their exact find spots and their relationship with each other. So that spatial analysis is really important in household archaeology. Now, gender archaeology, there's more inferring that goes on, because your cooking pots and storage jars, they're not gendered, right? So, and no one writes their name, this belongs to Miriam or Joseph or whomever. We don't have that. But using some of these other tools, we can make some guesses about, okay, who typically, did this kind of work. And again, food preparation seems to have been under the authority of the women of the household, in particular, the matriarch of the household.
If and when you find a sealed or a stamp and pressed jug or jar, does that then suggest that this was something that was taxed, some kind of that was collected or that was taxed and then was then given to a central authority? Could you then make the jump that wherever this was, this household, this community was under someone's jurisdiction, someone's authority, and that based on that seal impression, you could then say that these people were paying tax to a authority and that they were probably doing something to prepare, something. They were collecting taxes, and could you then say that this wasn't just a, out on the frontier or but this right. was a community, part of a state, let's say?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, if you were excavating a house and you found a storage room still full of storage jars or fragmented storage jars, and you looked, and let's say there was, a lamellic seal on one of them, which, would clearly indicate that this was something that was done to prepare people for the oncoming siege of the Assyrians in the 8th century. So yeah, I would say if you have anything that has anything kind of official, that brings up a whole nother set of questions.
And when you go out sifting your debris site, when you go dump all of your debris, and you find tiny little pieces of lead 40 years after the fact, that's clear evidence that the Bible is true, correct? Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in there. We can cut that. Are you
speaking from experience,
we can
Bob?
cut that. Yeah, that's how I do that's all credible archaeologists do archaeology, right? No, we can cut all this, but oh my gosh.
I appreciate the snark.
No, we haven't had one of these in a while, have we?
No, we haven't. And it was kind of nice.
I mean, Simca used to do this, but he hasn't been doing this for a while. Anyways, we'll cut all that. But anyways, when they we don't have to talk about it. You don't have to talk about it, but
we can if you want. I don't know much more than you do.
I mean, I can leave this part in there. I mean, we can leave this in there. But what are your so let's do it this way. What are your thoughts on the recent revelation of the discovery of the 2-centimeter lead supposed defixio, in the dump pile on Mount Eval in the West Bank, discovered without a license, or at least without a license from the IAA? See how when I made my video, I cut all of that. So it's still there. I've got it ready to put out in the outtakes. Yeah. But what are your thoughts on it? And you can speak directly to that discovery, or you can speak more direct or more generally about Bible, the use of the Bible in archaeology? I mean, free reign. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, regarding the so-called inscription, I mean, when these types of things happen, and I tend to not get too invested in it, just because I want to wait till things shake out a little. I haven't done a whole lot of research into it. I have read Christopher Ralston's blog post about it, which was very informative. So I would encourage anybody who wants to learn more about that to watch not only your video, Bob, but to check out Chris's blog post about it. Because, not being an expert in epigraphy, but I would say there are a few red flags for me. One is what you alluded to without having a permit. Two, that it was found in a dump pile. So completely out of context. There's no context for it. And context is, without it, it's even more speculative than before. So context is king or queen. So I think that's really important. The other thing too, that I would probably feel better about any kind of whatever interpretations that they're putting out there, the archaeologists who found it, is that the data hasn't been released. The photos haven't been released. They're keeping it, very top secret, I suppose, but that doesn't do you any favors.
Well, there's a sketch.
They drew a picture, though. They drew a picture.
Draw a picture too. It probably wouldn't look as good, but I could do it.
I mean, I've got pictures that my kids drew over here on the wall. I mean, it's.
They could probably do a good job too. But I would think, for me, if you're trying to convince an academic community of anything, you need to provide the evidence, and you need to be okay with people having full access to what you're saying your evidence is, and to be able to investigate it themselves and question it themselves. I mean, this is the whole, this is what we do, right? So right. You can't just make an announcement and then tuck it away and expect everyone to fully accept your interpretation of it. This is what we do. We find things, we write about it, and we have our colleagues talk it over and discuss it, argue about it, disagree about it. That's part of the process. That's part of what we do. And if you don't do that, then to me, that brings up some red flags.
That's the first thing I tell my grad students. So if I have an idea, I'll say, tell me why this is wrong. Tell me, and that's the essence of peer review. Tell me why this is wrong. What's wrong with this idea? And anytime somebody comes up and says, we found this new thing, but I'm not going to show you the thing, my question is, why not? Why wouldn't you put it out there and then let people start saying, well, no, this isn't right for this reason, or no, this isn't right for this reason? Because that's how the scientific process works, right? You throw all the theories out there, and the one that still stands is, right? Science doesn't prove anything, it only disproves. The scientific method doesn't prove anything, it only disproves. Mm-hmm. So you put all these theories out there, and the thing that doesn't get disproven is the thing that can still stand. And the fact that they won't even put it up there is just red flag number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. To do it right before Easter.
Their timing was really good.
Intentional.
Yeah, I mean, anyways.
But I would say this about any discovery, whether small or large.
Sure.
That this is part of the process. This is part of what we do, and if you don't do it, then it's going to cause some problems.
And I think for people getting into it, a lot of times you hear archaeologists or academics talk about the science of archaeology, and not always the interpretation that goes along with the science of archaeology. Because in reading the find or the finds and the context, there's a lot that happens. And when you are going in publicly with trowel in one hand and Bible in the other, does that affect your interpretation? And how do you read that as you read these articles? Because I know, Cynthia, you take students. I've gone with you as you take students, and this is something you are very upfront with as they dig. Of we're going to be digging, you're going to be finding things, but the interpretation part happens. But separating you and your personal interests, your personal faith, your personal beliefs from the things you are taking out, those can exist without one overcoming the other at all times. And it feels like sometimes that the science argument can get hyped up and pushed down the importance of that interpretation part. And how do you go about balancing that? Because I've heard it, but could you explain to some of the audience how you teach that to the students that are going out so that when they're reading these things, they can look for some of these things that if I was with Cynthia in the field, how do I balance this interpretation aspect that I'm seeing with this find?
Yeah, and that's part of the struggle, it really, because you, especially in the type of context that I'm teaching in, where I have a lot of students who are coming from Protestant Christian backgrounds, and a lot of them more on the more evangelical side of things. And so I really think that people are smart. If you put things in such a way that's going to be gracious, that's going to understand that they can understand these things, and not belittle what they think and hold dear, that they come around. I mean, I think it's all about your approach, really. And so one of the things, we talk about in class is, the Bible is its thing, archaeology is its thing. And yes, we can use them together, but we also have a whole bunch of other tools, as I've already mentioned, that we want to use everything at our disposal. We don't want to interpret one thing. We don't want to, just take the biblical text and say, well, look, we found this storage jar and it mentions in 2 Kings such and such a storage jar. So this must be Elisha's storage jar. Elijah, we don't, and we've seen a lot of that historically. And thank goodness we've kind of moved on from that. But it's up to us to help the more general audience learn that we've moved on from that. Because that is how archaeology of ancient Israel and the Bible lands, how that all got started, was making those biblical connections. So there is a history of that. But that, when it comes to actually doing field archaeology, that's, I think once students get out there and realize, oh, this is not as glamorous as I thought it was.
Well, yeah, yes. It's glorified gardening, right? I mean, it's a dirty.
It's glorified manual labor.
It's that you're paying for, right? The payment goes the other way. I mean, but it's, again, it really does matter where you go and where you're trained and who you're with and who you went on your first trip to Israel with. But again, it goes back to the public scholarship. This is why I think it's so important for scholars to speak out. I always appreciate scholars who speak to the public, whether it's on a blog or whether it's, it doesn't have to be a podcast or it doesn't have to be a YouTube video, but the scholars who will actually say, hey, I'm going to wait for all of the evidence to come out, but this is not how you do things, right? This is not a good way to, and I like to, I'm certainly more in the forefront than a lot of people, and I'm willing to say things because I was raised in this, right? And I know how a lot of people feel. I felt the same way, and I've worked through it. I have had the time to work through it, and I've been there. And I know how traumatic it is to start to change, to have to work through this. And I know the friends that leave you when you say, I don't feel this way anymore. And I know how hard that can be. But I also know how liberating it is to actually trust science, to actually say, I'm going to go with this evidence. And by the way, because of this, I don't have to try to defend some of the things I used to try to defend. And boy, that's a good feeling. And because then you can just say, oh yeah, math is actually a good thing. And logic is actually very nice. And instead of trying to defend a lot of this stuff. So I appreciate you talking to the public. I appreciate the way that you teach your students. I mean, this is you're doing great. And that's probably why we've got you here.
Thanks. I think though too, kind of if I could piggyback off of what you were saying, Bob, is that within a lot of circles, there's a us versus them mentality. And a lot of people have looked at archaeology, or so-called, biblical archaeology, is that if they're not trying to prove the Bible, then they're trying to disprove the Bible. And the approach I take with my students, both in the classroom and on the field, is no, neither. No one's trying to prove or disprove anything. We're just trying to learn as much as we can, using as many of the tools as we possibly can. And sometimes it's going to come across as being, very similar to with what we've read in the Bible or what we've learned about the Bible. Because let's be honest, a lot of times people are not remembering what they've read in the Bible itself. It's what they've heard is in the Bible, because people don't read the text anymore, generally speaking. And so that's, studies have shown that that's gone downhill as far as people actually reading the biblical text for themselves, as opposed to hearing somebody talk about it. So part of the battle is we have to think it's not a us versus them. It's not, we don't have to be afraid of the academy. They're not trying to disprove the Bible. They're not trying to destroy your faith. We're just trying to learn as much as we can about ancient Israel using whatever ways we can. And that's really about it.
And I think therein lies the crux of the whole thing. If you are afraid of just learning data, if you are afraid of, let's not try to go in there with one person. Let's just go in there and look at the data, ask the questions, and see where the data leads us. If you are afraid of that question, if you can't engage that process without signing a statement of faith promising to only say what our pre-agreed upon, doctrinal statement set, then there's a problem, right? If you say we're only gonna do this after you read our 13 points of, here's what we believe going into it. Here's how we're gonna do it. If you can't just engage in science, if you can't just go and do the discovery and go where the data leads, if you're afraid of that process, you've got a problem to begin with.
And where the data leads right now, as opposed to where it could lead, 10, 15, 20, 100 years from now, when we're learning more and discovering more and hopefully uncovering more things in the archaeological record too.
Right. We've got a few minutes left. Is there anything that you want us to know? And then I'll let these guys ask a last couple things. What do you want to tell us? What do you want us to know?
Let's see. Just, I'm plugging away on different projects, and, the food and the Hebrew Bible, the handbook one, that was a big one, and that's out now. So you can find it on Amazon or the TNT Clark website. I will be moving to Waco this summer. So if anyone needs to get a hold of me, you'll have to find my new email address.
Say hi to Chip and Joanna for us.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I would agree. I love what I do, and I'm privileged to be able to do it full time and as my profession. And I think we're very lucky.
Yeah, that is true.
Thinking back to like the you that started out on this venture, Is there something that you've learned or say in the field that you found or something that really stands out to you that like this is something that young me really was looking for or would really be excited to know that we actually did?
Wow, I've never had that question before. That's a really good one.
What are you most proud of? Yeah, well, I guess what are you most proud of? What's the thing that you were like, I did that?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like what's the most interesting thing you found question a little bit. But, my very first season excavating as a brand new master's student, because when I was an undergrad, I did historical geography tours and we did a couple like digs for the day type thing, but wasn't at an institution that had a field archaeology class. So when I started my master's and I did my first full season, and that was at Tel Rehov with Ami Mazar, and my very first season there, the fourth week of the dig, I was moved to a different square, and my friend Mandy and I were excavating in there, and we came across this broken lid thing. And, we're just brand new. We're novices. We have no idea what we're doing. And it just looked very interesting. And it had like the face of a lion molded onto it and human heads or whatever. And we were a little freaked out by it, to be honest, because it was a little scary looking. And it turns out that the couple pieces together made a model shrine. Oh. And it's in the Israel Museum with the other Rehov horned altar. And so every time I'm in the Israel Museum, I go and say hi to it. And for me, that, and then just the week before that, we had found a female figurine. And to me, just the whole religion aspect, the religious ritual aspect that Israel and Judah, they, according to the Hebrew Bible, they're supposed to worship God alone. But if you keep reading, you learn that they didn't do that so well most of the time. And then to be excavating and to find these figurines, which of course there's lots of debate about, naturally there would be, but that's one of the theories, is that these are the so-called teraphim, the idols that are mentioned in the Hebrew Bible that the Israelites and Judahites worshipped along with Adonai. So to me, as a brand new, field archaeologist and someone who knew the Hebrew Bible and would always like argue with people about, or have discussions with people about, no, Israel, they were supposed to worship God alone, but they really did a bad job at it if you just keep reading. And so to be able to find these things that talked about, that was the physical representation of Israel's history. So the way I describe archaeology is it's history you can see and touch. It's history you can put your hands on. And so for me as a visual learner, and I think there's a lot of people like me out there, that was really helpful to not just read it, but to see it and to touch it, and to be the one that found it even more was really profound for me. So whenever I find like a jar handle and I can feel the thumbprint of the potter, or even sometimes see the thumbprint or fingerprint, that still blows my mind. It still just is like, it moves me. It's like, wow, I'm holding this thing that hasn't been touched or seen in thousands of years. And here I am uncovering it and hopefully, bringing some life back to it. But yeah, it's just, I get all like, emotional about it.
Well, I that's wonderful. I mean, that's anytime you can touch history, that's beautiful. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott, thank you so much for joining us on the Tower of Bible podcast. Jordan, anything closing?
If you have more questions, I'd also recommend The 5-Minute Archaeologist, edited by Cynthia. If you have questions we didn't address, it's nice short chapters written by a number of archaeologists to address other questions you may have if you're interested in looking for more.
Well, thank you.
Thank you again for joining us on the Tower of Bible podcast. For Jordan and Jordan, I'm Bob Cargill, wishing you everything the best.
Thank you very much for having me. It was fun.